Welcome to this week's edition of Ask an MS Expert. I'm John Strum, and I'm the host of the Real Talk MS podcast. Each week, Real Talk MS reaches thousands of people in more than 100 countries around the world with the news that people affected by MS need to know. My wife, Jean, lived with progressive MS for 23 years, so I've had a front row seat experiencing all the ways that MS can impact a family. Currently, I'm a member of the International Progressive MS Alliance Scientific Steering Committee. I'm a district activist leader and trustee for the National MS Society, and I chair the Society's California Government Relations Advisory Committee. I want to thank all of you and welcome you, especially those who are joining on GoToWebinar, Facebook Live, YouTube Live, and Twitch. The MS Society's Ask an MS Expert webcast is designed to give us a place for the MS community to connect and to connect you with MS experts who are ready to answer your questions on the topics that impact people affected by MS every day. Please feel free to post your comments and questions in the GoToWebinar chat box. MS navigators are online throughout today's program, answering questions and connecting you with resources. Autologous hematopoietic stem cell transplantation, or aHSCT, for multiple sclerosis has gained increasing interest in recent years. Researchers have seen significant progress in the initial clinical trials. We're joined today by Dr. Jeffrey Cohen, director of the Cleveland Clinic Mellen Center and the Mellen Center Experimental Therapeutics program, and we're here to take a deep dive into aHSCT in MS. Welcome, Dr. Cohen, and thank you for being here today.
Well, hello again, John. Thanks for having me.
There's growing evidence that aHSCT can effectively reboot the immune system in some people living with ML. Let me say that right, in some people living with MS. Can you tell us what aHSCT is, and is this the procedure that's also known as bone marrow transplant?
Yeah, so to start with your second question, frequently this is referred to as a bone marrow transplant, although technically that's not correct at this point anymore. So aHSCT is a multi-step process. It involves, first of all, collecting the hematopoietic stem cells, the stem cells that give rise to the elements of the blood, the white blood cells, the red blood cells, and the platelets, storing them, and then that's followed by the so-called conditioning regimen. So in that step, the existing immune system, the one that's causing multiple sclerosis, is eliminated through the use of usually high-dose chemotherapy. And then it's allowed to reform, and that reforming is accelerated by transplantation of hematopoietic stem cells. So the important points are that it's a complicated multi-step process, and also that each of those steps potentially can have complications, can have side effects. And third, that there still is some uncertainty about the optimal way to perform each of those steps, and we'll probably talk about all of those issues subsequently.
I'm sure we're going to get to them. I know that the A in aHSCT stands for autologous. Can you tell us what that means?
Well, so that means that the hematopoietic stem cells come from the person themselves. So they're removed, frozen, and then re-administered at the appropriate time. So that's in contrast to what's called allogeneic hematopoietic stem cell transplant, which is also sometimes done for other conditions, in which case the stem cells come from another donor, from somebody else, usually matched in some way, so they're not rejected. But in this case, the stem cells come from the person themselves.
I see. The National MS Society's National Medical Advisory Committee has developed recommendations for the optimal use of aHSCT in MS. According to these recommendations, who are the best candidates for this procedure?
Right. So the best candidates are people that are the most likely to benefit and the least likely to sustain harm from the procedure. As I said, it is a somewhat aggressive, complicated procedure, and we want to make sure we can avoid complications if we can. So this is an immune therapy. It has largely the same job as our approved disease-modifying therapies. In other words, to stop relapses and to stop MRI lesion activity, so new lesions or active lesions, and as a result, to prevent the accumulation of disability. It unfortunately does not appear to be as helpful for the aspects of MS that cause progression, which are mainly is the result of neurodegeneration. So the people that are most likely to benefit are younger people, people that are still that are having relapses or active MRI scans, and who are continuing to have that activity despite treatment with some of the available therapies. And then conversely, the people that are less likely to benefit and are more likely to have harm are people that are older, who have very severe disability already, and who have other medical conditions that might make the procedure less safe.
Well, thank you for pointing out that it may not be a terrific option for someone who's living with progressive MS. I think that sometimes when we think about something that's described as a complex procedure, you think that therefore it may be the right tool for complex disease activity, but that doesn't seem to be the case here.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's not that we want to withhold this procedure from people in that situation. It's that experience has told us that it's not likely to be helpful and it's more likely to cause complications. There are other stem cell therapy approaches that are being evaluated in that situation.
Well, to this point, we've heard from one of our viewers, Anton, who wants to know who should be helping assess whether he may be an appropriate candidate for aHSCT.
Yeah, so usually that evaluation has two components. So one is an evaluation by a neurologist with expertise in multiple sclerosis to help determine whether the person is likely to benefit. They have the characteristics that I was just describing, and also to see whether they have other better options. Although hematopoietic stem cell transplant is being used earlier and earlier in the treatment sequence, generally, at least our approach in my institution is to advise it for people that at least have tried something. And then the other aspect of the evaluation is by the transplant team. And their job primarily is to make sure that the transplant can be done safely reasonably safely in that person.
I want to get back to the safety issue in just a moment. We've got a question from Patricia, and it relates to something you actually just said, and that was the role of an MS specialist in this entire process. Can you talk a little bit about what that role is in patient care before, during, and after aHSCT?
Well, so before the transplant, it's to assess vis-a-vis transplant the likelihood that person would benefit. Are they in fact having relapses or active MRIs? And is that happening despite trying at least some therapy? During the transplant, their job is during the transplant procedure, their job is to help assess and manage any neurologic issues that arise during the transplant. People can have relapses during that procedure, or they can have other neurologic complications unrelated to MS. And then after the transplant, their job is to help monitor for any complications, infections, bleeding, those sorts of things, and also to continue to manage the MS. Now, when we're lucky, the transplant is a very effective treatment for MS, and there is no other treatment needed. But and that's part of the reason why there's so much excitement about transplant. But it doesn't work 100% in everybody, and the neurologist needs to help determine whether the transplant has worked, and if not, what's going to be done afterwards.
Well, let's circle back to the safety issue. It's certainly something that I've heard you stress. Can you tell us about the safety associated with this procedure? What are some of the risks that are involved in aHSCT?
Yeah, so it is a significant undertaking. Going through the steps that I already talked about, during the mobilization and the harvest, that's the collection of the stem cells, there is a possibility of producing a relapse. Some of the medications that are used in that stage sometimes can cause a relapse. The cells are usually harvested by what's called leukapheresis. That's sort of akin to dialysis. So there sometimes can be complications of that. But the step that has the most problem is the conditioning regimen. So that's generally high-dose chemotherapy. So those medications themselves can have side effects, nausea, hair loss, infertility, mucositis, inflammation of the linings of the mouth, for example, or there may be indirect effects. So during the period where the immune system has been eliminated, someone is prone to infections, and if there's collateral damage to the bone marrow, there may be bleeding, there may be anemia. So that's the stage that has the most potential complications. And part of the reason for the transplant in this case is to make that stage as short as possible to speed up the recovery of the bone marrow. And then finally, the transplant itself can produce complications, so-called graft reaction. So people can have a reaction to the hematopoietic stem cell transplant, and that typically is treated with steroids. So each of those stages can have complications, and that's why we want to try to do the procedure in a way that's as safe as possible.
Well, I've heard you say that this is a significant undertaking. Is there an optimal aHSCT protocol for treating MS?
Well, I think many of the steps are pretty well worked out at this point, but there is still some debate amongst the transplant physicians about the optimal way of doing all those steps. And the one that there's probably the most debate about is what's the most appropriate conditioning regimen. With at one end of the extreme, some centers advocating for the most intense regimen, with the idea that that's the most likely to have benefit and to have the most durable benefit. In other words, control the MS the longest. But those more intense regimens are also the ones that are the most risky. And then at the other end of the extreme are the least intense regimens. The idea being that those will be safer and better tolerated. But there's been some concern that those less intense regimens may not have as consistent a benefit. They may not work as consistently, and that the benefit may wear off, that the MS may stay under control for some length of time and then come back. So the person has gone through this whole procedure and 5 years later their MS is active again. And I have seen a few patients that's happened in. So the most common regimen is a compromise, one that's in between, that's we think is potent enough to get the MS under control and to keep it under control, but has reasonable safety and tolerability. That's the so-called BEAM regimen, which are initials that represent the medicines that make it up.
I see. Well, certainly is a multi-step process here. As you said, complex process. How long is the hospital stay associated with this treatment?
Well, so that varies somewhat as to which conditioning regimen is used, but on average, it's several weeks to a month and a half. If there's complications, then it's longer. But with the regimen that we're using at our institution, which is BEAM, it's generally a 3 to 4 week hospitalization.
Well, let's spend a few minutes talking about where to get this procedure done and maybe where not to get this procedure done. We've heard from Paula, who wants to know what she should be considering in trying to select a safe and credible place for getting aHSCT.
Yeah, so I usually advise my patients that there are a couple things they need to investigate. So one is that this procedure should only be done at programs that have experience and expertise in transplant, because as I discussed, it's a difficult procedure, and we want to make sure it's done right. But they should also have access to or an active collaboration with neurologists with expertise and experience in multiple sclerosis, because one's MS can go haywire during the procedure, and a neurologist to manage that needs to be available. So that's one question that needs to be asked. The second question is, what are the plans before transplant for the transplant program to get all the information they need to make sure that this is an appropriate person to undergo transplant and that they can go undergo transplant safely? And what are the plans after transplant for follow-up to monitor for and manage any complications and to monitor someone's multiple sclerosis? It can't just be left up to the person with MS to make those arrangements. So I would be a little bit wary of a place that just gives you a handout afterwards and says, okay, give this to your neurologist and tell them you underwent transplant. So that's the question. And then the other thing to investigate is, to some extent, the details of the transplant procedure that they're proposing, including which conditioning regimen and that they're planning on using and why they're proposing that one. I mean, it stands to reason that you should know something about what treatment is being planned for you.
How can someone go about finding an aHSCT clinical trial or treatment center? And perhaps you can explain the difference between the two and whether one option is preferred over the other.
Well, so because of the emerging publications about transplant, I think there's a lot of interest in this procedure that's developing, both among people with MS and also in the neurologic community. And at this point, I think many of us would agree that transplant is a very reasonable option for someone with very active MS. It's just not come under control with the available disease-modifying therapies. And a number of groups, including the National MS Society, have come out advocating that as in that situation, transplant should be considered. But a more important question is perhaps whether transplant should be considered as an alternative to our already available highly efficacious therapies. That maybe someone doesn't have to fail everything before transplant should be considered, and that's where there's a lot of debate still. And so to try to address that question, there are several formal clinical trials underway to address that question. One of those, which I happen to be the principal investigator on, is called BEAT MS. So this is a trial that's sponsored by the NIAID branch of NIH to compare hematopoietic stem cell transplant directly against our best available therapies, the highly efficacious therapies that are already approved, to try to see how transplant rates compared to those therapies, and not only whether it's more efficacious, more effective, but also how does its safety compare, and importantly, how does it compare economically? Transplants are an expensive procedure, but so are our medications. And within 2 to 3 years, if someone undergoes transplant and does not require ongoing therapy, it actually becomes cost effective. So the hope of Beat MS is that we will confirm that it's a useful alternative for appropriate people, and that it's reasonably safe and cost effective. So if people want to get information about that trial, they can get it either from the National MS Society, from clinicaltrials.gov. So that's a site that the FDA manages, or from the Beat MS website itself, beat-ms.org.
We've heard about unregulated stem cell clinics that claim to have cured people with MS. What can you tell us about these stem cell centers that pretend to be regulated, safe, and for that matter, even effective?
Well, so I would be very cautious about those claims at this point. I mean, I myself am very interested in stem cell therapies, but there still are a lot of unanswered questions. We know the most about hematopoietic stem cell transplant because that's been done in MS and other conditions now for probably 20, 30 years or more. But there still are some unanswered questions there. And the other stem cell therapies are still, I consider, very investigational, very experimental. We don't know how to do them correctly, and we don't know how to. We don't know how well they work. We don't know their safety. So I would advise people to be very cautious about pursuing other stem cell therapies in these commercial stem cell clinics. I think it's premature.
So how can someone tell the difference between stem cell centers that pretend to be legitimate and a credible stem cell center? What are some of the red flags we should be looking out for?
Well, I think that if they're advertising stem cell therapy for every known medical condition, that would be an immediate red flag. And if it's a freestanding clinic that's not associated with legitimate medical programs, and third, if that program has not published their results in reputable scientific journals. At this point, most stem cell therapies are experimental, and so if they're being done outside of a formal clinical trial, that's a little bit suspicious. With the exception, I would say, of hematopoietic stem cell transplant. That is something that's part of standard medical therapy for some conditions, and it's becoming appropriate in multiple sclerosis. And then in some very limited examples of stem cells where they're isolated directly during the procedure and administered back into the same tissue. So, for example, during joint repair, that's probably appropriate at this point. But removing stem cells from the bone marrow, for example, mesenchymal stem cells, and then administering them to cure some other disease, that's kind of suspicious at this point in my mind.
Going back to some of the more credible institutions, can you tell us what the approximate cost of aHSCT to treat MS might be?
So at this point, it's about $100,000 to $150,000. It's actually a little bit hard to get a handle on that, given our medical billing system in the United States. But it's an expensive procedure, but multiple sclerosis disease modifying therapies cost about $60,000 to $80,000 a year. So within 2 or 3 years, transplant becomes cost effective. But the important point is that it's oftentimes very difficult to get insurance coverage for transplant in the current situation. So that's oftentimes the biggest obstacle, even for people for whom transplant is appropriate, is to get coverage for it. So That's part of the purpose of the ongoing clinical trials, is to show that it shouldn't be considered a last resort. There are people for whom it's appropriate, and it should be covered. That's one of our purposes. The other point I wanted to make that you alluded to previously is that the ongoing clinical trials are being conducted at centers. All of the centers involved, for example, in Beat MS, are at centers that have both expertise in transplant and expertise in MS. Most of those centers, including our own, are also performing hematopoietic stem cell transplant in some people that for whom it seems appropriate, but for one reason or another, they're not eligible for Beat MS. So that's where I would pursue it at this point, is at those centers, because they have to have a transplant program in place to be part of the trial.
Well, you've shared a lot of really valuable information with us about aHSCT. What would you say are the top 3 takeaways that you'd like our audience to remember?
One is the excitement that many of us have about the potential for hematopoietic stem cell transplant to be a very effective and reasonably safe and cost-effective treatment for multiple sclerosis. 2, that it is a complicated, potentially risky procedure. And 3, one needs to be cautious in general in pursuing stem cell therapies, and the buyer should be aware what they're getting themselves into.
Well, I want to thank everyone for submitting some great questions, and thank you, Dr. Cohen, for being with us today.
Thanks for having me.
I think that one of the best things that anyone can do for themselves, especially during these uncertain times, is to make sure that the information they're getting is credible and reliable. So we'd like to share some resources with you, and these are resources that you can count on to be current and credible. I want to remind you that the National MS Society's MS Navigator team is your best partner when it comes to connecting you to the very best information and resources on living with MS. You can reach an MS Navigator by phone, email, or through the Society's website by chat. For information and resources on MS, please visit the Society's website. You'll find research updates and news, information on connection programs like self-help groups and MS Friends. You'll see ways to get involved, and you'll find out about upcoming events that are happening near you. Remember, you can connect with the National MS Society and others affected by MS on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, YouTube, and LinkedIn. And I hope you'll join me every week on the Real Talk MS podcast, where I continue the conversation that we start right here. You'll find Real Talk MS at realtalkms.com, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, or wherever you find your favorite podcasts. I'd like to thank Dr. Cohen for being with us today. Please remember that a recording of this webinar will be available at the Society's website at nationalmssociety.org/MSexpert, as well as on our Facebook and YouTube pages. I hope you'll join us at this same time for next week's edition of Ask an MS Expert. You can always find out what our upcoming program topics are all about on the National MS Society's website. And now I have a favor to ask each of you. Getting your feedback on today's webinar is important. So you'll see a survey pop up in a moment when we close out the webinar. And if you're watching on Facebook Live, you'll see a link to that survey pinned to the comments section. On YouTube, you'll find that link in the program description. Completing the survey makes a real difference. The information you provide helps us continuously improve, and it helps shape future programs. The survey takes just 1 minute, so I hope you'll take a minute and please fill it out. On behalf of Dr. Jeffrey Cohen and the National MS Society, I want to thank you once again for joining us. Please stay safe and make healthy choices.